The vote was already happening when I walked in. No one handed me a program. Observers do not get programs. We get a numbered seat and a laminated pass that reads non-voting entity in 14 languages. Mine was green. It was always green. I had stopped asking why years ago. Seat 41. Upper gallery. Left side, third row, close enough to the ventilation duct that I could hear it hum when the chamber went quiet. I sat down, arranged my bag under the seat, and took out a nutrition block, because the session had started at midday and I had not eaten since morning, and the Galactic Council, for all its architectural grandeur, had not once in 62 years thought to put a water fountain on the observer level. Below me, the Grand Assembly floor stretched out in concentric rings. 311 seats, arranged in species-specific clusters, each station calibrated for atmospheric preference and gravity tolerance. The VETH had chairs that reclined at 17 degrees. The Rin chorus floated in membrane pods that pulsed faintly blue. The Kethori sat directly on the stone floor, which they had requested themselves, and they looked like they had been sitting there for a century and intended to remain. 47 species, 311 voting delegates. 0 humans with a vote. This had never been new. Humans had been council members for 62 standard years and observer class for all of them. We attended every session, received every briefing, and sat in the gallery watching decisions get made about us with the same procedural courtesy extended to a weather system that someone had decided to formally acknowledge. Councillor Davansoth of the VETH stood at the central podium. He was tall in the way that made height feel like a policy position, and he spoke in the low harmonic register that made the floor resonate faintly beneath your feet. I had heard him speak in 3 different chambers over 12 years. He always sounded like he was delivering a consequence he had warned you about previously and was taking no satisfaction in repeating. He was reading the resolution. I had read it 3 days ago. I had read a draft of it 6 weeks before that. Someone always sent me these things early, through channels that were never quite official, as if my awareness of the content before the vote would change something, as if I were going to do something about it. The Pacification Decree. In recognition of the demonstrated pattern of armed conflict initiation, perpetuation, and escalation attributable to the human species across 62 standard years of Galactic Council membership. This body moves to formally prohibit human participation in any armed engagement, military advisory role, weapons development program, or tactical consultation within Council jurisdiction, effective upon passage. Davansoth paused. The chamber leaned in the way large rooms do when they are full of species who breathe at different rates, but all recognize the weight of a pause. I bit into the nutrition block. Orange flavor, the worst one. The green ones had been gone when I passed the vendor on level 4, and the blue ones were somehow even worse, so orange it was. The Rin delegate spoke next. She was small and silver-toned and moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had reached a conclusion long before anyone else had finished asking the question. She activated a holographic display that rose from the floor in clean blue light. Data columns, trajectory lines, 62 years of council recorded history reduced to geometry. 14 wars with confirmed human involvement. 42 armed conflicts with documented human advisory presence. 307 additional engagements where human tactical frameworks had been identified in the operational record. All of it blue, all of it clean, all of it making 62 years of difficult, necessary work look like a character flaw. She spoke for a long time. I looked at the ceiling. I counted the panels. There were 216, arranged in a tessellated pattern that someone had clearly intended to be mathematically satisfying, and it was almost but not quite. Then she said it. She said it in the careful, considered voice her species used when they were genuinely trying to understand something, rather than performing understanding for the room. We do not understand why you do it. The floor was very quiet. I looked at my nutrition block. Because you asked us to. The thought was completely clear. It sat behind my teeth and I let it sit there. I did not say it. The vote ran for 40 minutes. Each species block in sequence, the tally board running live behind the podium. Green for support, red for opposition. The green side moved fast. Veth block 40 votes, all green. Rin chorus 22, all green. Selvani Tor the Verk delegation green, 3 green and 1 abstain. I watched the Cathori station. 20 delegates, all of them military adjacent in their civilian roles, logistics coordinators, resource ministers, the kinds of positions that cultures build around people who would have been soldiers if their society had invented the word yet. I had worked with the Cathori 6 years ago during the Ven engagement. Their field medicine had been catastrophic, not for lack of willingness, for lack of framework. No triage doctrine, no evacuation protocol. No system for deciding, in the first hour after an engagement, who could be saved and who could not. Their medics were giving equal time to everyone, which meant no one was getting the right amount of time. They were losing people who could have been saved. I had spent 9 days writing a triage framework for them, adapted for Cathori physiology. Their casualty rate dropped by 40% in the following campaign. The Cathari board went red. All 20 votes, red. Then the 2 Dranathi holdouts went red. The Solvari 8 went red. The Verk abstention revised to red. Final count, 311 in favor, 4 opposed. The 4 who voted no were the 4 species whose soldiers had worked directly alongside human advisors in active engagements. I thought about that carefully. I thought about what it meant that the 311 who voted yes had, in many cases, been trained by military frameworks built by the 4 who voted no. The session chair confirmed the decree binding and effective immediately. The chamber response was polite, 47 varieties of approval sounding different from each other but carrying the same shape. Something had been decided. Something had been contained. I folded my nutrition block wrapper into a small rectangle and put it in my jacket pocket. I picked up my bag and walked out. The corridor outside the gallery was the long kind that echoes, and my footsteps sounded patient in it, which was right. I was not angry. I was not shocked. I was a person who had looked at a map 2 nights before and already understood exactly what the vote would mean and what it would not mean, and those were 2 very different things. In my room that evening, I poured 2 fingers of something imported and mediocre and stood at the observation window. Space is never actually dark. People say it is because of the color, but it is full, signals, ships, histories, the long consequence of every choice every species ever made when they thought they were deciding alone. I pulled out my handheld and opened the conflict map. Active engagements, color-coded by species, updated every 6 hours. I ran my filter, the private one I had built and maintained for 8 years, labeled in my own shorthand, never requested by anyone, never removed by anyone because nobody knew it existed. Human tactical doctrine detected. The map lit up. Not everywhere, but in 46 places. Enough that the distribution looked less like isolated incidents and more like a nervous system, signals running between nodes, familiar patterns repeating in colors that were not human but were structured in ways that were. I looked at it for a long time. The vote was 311 to 4. The map had 46 signatures. The council had just closed a door. The room behind that door had 46 fires burning in it, all built from wood that had been sitting there for years, and none of them had needed a human hand to strike the match in a very long time. I finished my drink. I went to sleep. They gave me a title that sounded like a promotion. Cultural Liaison Coordinator, Veth Prime Station. Lovely office. High ceilings. A window that looked out over the Veth City grid, which at night was a specific shade of amber that reminded me of old photographs, the kind that had not been taken in 100 years but still showed up in dreams. I had a desk. An assistant named Petra who was thorough and cheerful in a way that felt like being professionally managed, and a schedule full of what the reassignment brief called diplomatic engagement opportunities. Receptions, dinners, cultural exchange sessions where a delegate from another species would share their history, and I would nod and contribute observations, and everyone would agree it had been a wonderful evening. I attended 41 of these in the first 6 months. I ate a lot of food I could not identify. I smiled with the specific muscles that do not involve the eyes. I wore the dress uniform I had kept in a bag for 3 years because there had never been a reason to take it out. I was very good at receptions. Being good at receptions is not something you are born with. It is a skill you build through repetition, through learning exactly how much honesty to offer and when to stop, through becoming comfortable with the fact that the most important conversations are always happening 3 rooms away from you, and there is nothing you can do about it. The reception at Veth Prime's diplomatic quarter on the 6-month mark of the decree was, by all visible measures, identical to the previous 40. Different menu. Same geometry of people standing in clusters, trying to look relaxed about things that were not relaxing. I had been standing near the window for 20 minutes, holding a glass of something that tasted like it wanted to be wine but had given up halfway through, when Kalesor found me. He was Drenathi, 7 feet tall, broad in the way that species grow broad when their home planet runs heavy gravity. He wore a dress uniform that was immaculate and formal, and if you knew what to look for, was a direct structural descendant of the Coalition field uniform I had helped redesign 9 years ago. The collar was different. The fastening system had been adapted for Drenathi physiology, but the bone structure was the same. Someone had learned the original and then made it theirs. He was wearing 7 campaign ribbons on his left side. I looked at them the way I always looked at ribbons, the way you look at something you helped build before you fully understood what it would become. He said it was a pleasure to meet me formally. I said the same. We talked about the Veth City grid, which we could both see through the window, and about the current negotiations between the Tor and the Selvani over a disputed shipping corridor, which both of us knew far more about than we were saying. Then, in the way that conversations at receptions shift when someone has been waiting for exactly the right moment, when the surrounding noise is right and the nearest delegates have drifted to the next cluster, he said, I wanted to ask you something about the Torian situation. The Torian conflict was officially a border dispute between the Tor and the Drenathi over agricultural rights on 3 transitional moons, 11 months running. Officially, nothing to do with humans. I sipped my almost wine. Of course, I said, cultural context. He almost smiled. Cultural context, yes. He produced a small display from his palm unit, the kind meant to look casual, the kind meant to look like someone sharing a dinner recommendation rather than operational data. The map it showed was current. 3-front engagement, northern sector stretched thin, supply lines threading through secondary corridors. I recognized the structure. Not because I had designed that specific campaign, but because I had designed the framework that any commander trained in coalition doctrine would apply when facing those exact terrain variables and that exact resource distribution. It was the logical output of the system, like hearing a sentence in a language you taught to someone who then taught it to someone else, and recognizing the grammar even when the words are different. Our Northern Command, he said, keeping his voice measured, has been extending into territory our logistics cannot currently support. Our advisors are debating whether to hold position or pull back and establish a resupply anchor. What does the ground data show about the Tor's secondary positioning? He looked at me. You want the ground data? I'm asking a cultural question about tactical decision-making frameworks. which is entirely within my current role. He sent the data to my handheld without another word. I looked at it. I looked at it the way you look at something you have seen 100 versions of, not the specific instance but the shape beneath it, the logic that generates it regardless of who is running it. The Tor had pulled their eastern flank in tight, too tight. They were compressing, not reinforcing. It was positioning that looked like a defensive choice and was actually a preparation to advance from a direction no one was watching. A compressed flank was not a retreating flank. It was potential energy. "Hold north," I said. "Do not advance. The eastern compression is not a retreat, it is preparation." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map, seeing what I had just pointed to. "And if our commanders push to advance? Ask them where they learned to read a compressed flank." I put my handheld away. "Then ask them who taught their instructors." We stood at the window for a while after that. The city was doing its amber thing below. His ribbons caught the light. I counted them properly, 7. I had contributed to the doctrine that shaped 4 of those 7 engagements. Not directly. Through the chain, through people I had trained who then trained others, through manuals I had written that became source material for other manuals, through frameworks that had been translated, adapted, localized, and issued to command staff who had never once heard my name. That is the thing about fire. Once it catches, it does not remember the match. He said, before walking back into the reception, that speaking with someone of my background was invaluable, that the human perspective on these matters was something the council had perhaps been too quick to remove from formal consultation. I said thank you. He walked away. I stayed at the window for another few minutes. Then I went back to my room, changed out of the dress uniform, made something warm from the small unit on my desk, and opened the conflict map. The 46 signatures from 6 months ago were now 51. I was not surprised. I was something closer to the specific tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from being right about something for a very long time in rooms full of people who needed another 6 months to arrive at the same conclusion. 3 of the new signatures were in species that had never had direct human advisory contact. They had been trained by species that had. 2nd generation. The doctrine was moving on its own now, through command academies, field manuals, and after-action reports, adapting as it spread, the way anything spreads when it answers a genuine need. You cannot ban an idea by removing the person who first had it. You can try. 311 species tried in a marble hall with a very official vote. The map had 51 signatures. I read for a while, a history text on pre-contact Drenathi military structure that I had been meaning to finish for 2 years. Dry and detailed, and exactly the kind of reading that brings your mind down to a manageable speed. Before I slept, I thought about Kael'sor's ribbons, specifically the 3 I had nothing to do with. Those were the ones I kept coming back to. He had earned those 3 entirely through frameworks that had been built on human foundations, but extended well beyond them, adapted by Drenathi commanders for Drenathi terrain and Drenathi operational rhythms in ways I would not have designed and had not foreseen. The students had not just repeated the lesson, they had continued it. That was the part nobody in the council chamber had said out loud. The ban had not been placed on weapons or tactics, it had been placed on teachers, and the students were already teaching. The map had 51 signatures, and the number was going to keep rising, and the council was going to keep being puzzled about why, and no one was going to connect the dots clearly for at least another year. I turned off the light. I went to sleep. Dr. Sievelin contacted me through the Cultural Exchange Office in the standard way, a formal request, properly filed, 3 days' notice, a brief outlining the academic purpose. She was writing a comprehensive study on what she called human conflict heritage. She wanted 3 hours of structured interview time. She had a prepared list of questions and a recording device, and 2 of her 4 hands already taking notes when I walked in. She was young for her species, which for the Rin meant approximately 40 standard years, and she had the focused, slightly relentless energy of someone who had decided that understanding something completely was a reasonable goal, and had not yet reached the point where you learn that some things are built to resist complete understanding on purpose. I sat across from her. She offered something warm to drink. I accepted. It tasted like mint crossed with something metallic, which was either very good or very bad Rin hospitality, and I had never worked out which. She asked her first question from the list. Something about early human military history, the general shape of how we had organized conflict before we knew anyone else existed. I answered, accurate, informative, not particularly revealing. Then she asked the second question, which was not on her list. What made it different, she said. Not the numbers, we have the numbers. What was the actual difference? I looked at her for a moment. Logistics, I said. All 4 of her hands paused. Not weapons. Every species we have ever encountered had developed methods of doing physical harm to other members of their own kind before they developed spaceflight. Weapons are not the variable. She wrote that down, then logistics. Logistics, supply chain management, the ability to move food, medicine, equipment, and personnel across distance under conditions that were actively trying to destroy the supply line. The ability to keep a force functional not for a single engagement, but for a sustained campaign that might run for years. I put my cup down. Every species has soldiers. Every species has the capacity for conflict. What most species do not have before contact is the infrastructure to sustain a prolonged effort. They have intense, short engagements. They have raids. They have territorial confrontations that resolve quickly because neither side can maintain operational capacity past a certain threshold. The limiting factor is not courage or capability. It is supply. She had all 4 hands moving now. Humans solved the supply problem, I said. Over thousands of years, running conflicts against ourselves on one planet, we refined the science of keeping a fighting force alive and functional for as long as the situation required. We developed field medicine that could treat injuries under active conditions. We developed psychological support systems for people in prolonged stress. We built rotation schedules, morale infrastructure, the specific accounting of how much food a person needs each day to remain effective, the minimum sleep hours before decision-making degrades, the threshold at which a unit needs to be cycled out of forward position before it stops being useful. Sivalin looked up from her notes. You turned endurance into a system, she said. We turned everything into a system. That is the actual human contribution to galactic military history, not aggression, not exceptional courage. Systems. The systematic management of the things that make conflict survivable for the people in it. She was quiet for a moment. Her 4th hand stopped writing. She was looking at me with the expression her species makes when they are recalibrating something they thought they already understood. I kept going. The Drenathi had come to us during the Vel campaign with a field mortality rate that was breaking their command structure. Their soldiers were brave and capable, but they had no triage protocol, no system for deciding, in the first hour after an engagement, who needed immediate treatment and who needed to wait. Their medics spent equal time on everyone, which meant no one received the right amount of time. They were losing people who could have been saved. 9 days. That was how long it took me and a medical officer named Claire Fenn to write a triage framework adapted for Drenathi physiology, field-tested in the following engagement. Casualty rate dropped by 38%. Claire had gone home after the decree came through. She ran a civilian hospital on Kepler Station now. She sent me brief updates sometimes, patient numbers, staffing challenges, the ordinary maintenance of a life that had been rerouted from the thing it was built for. The Rin Chorus had no command rotation system. Their commanders were dying from exhaustion, not through enemy action. They simply ran their leadership into the ground, burning through their best strategic minds in campaigns that lasted longer than any individual could sustain at the required level of function. A structured rotation schedule, adapted from coalition doctrine, had been introduced. It had been so thoroughly absorbed that the current RIN command manual attributed it as original RIN methodology. I did not mention this detail. I had learned when to keep going and when to let something sit. The Cathari had no framework for what happened to soldiers after a prolonged campaign. They understood that the body could be physically damaged. They had nothing for the damage that did not appear on a medical scan: the disrupted sleep, the lost concentration, the specific hollowing that follows months of sustained high-stress operations. Their commanders were confused by soldiers who had survived a campaign and then became non-functional. No word existed in their language for it. A psychologist named Owen Dale had spent 4 months working with Cathari medical staff. He built a screening framework from first principles, cross-referencing human research with what we could learn about Cathari neural architecture. He wrote a field identification guide for command staff. He trained 12 Cathari medical officers. He had insisted throughout that the framework be expressed entirely in Cathari language and grounded in Cathari experience, not a translation of a human concept, an original construction that described something the Cathari had always experienced but never named. They had a word for it now. All 4 of Sivalin's hands had stopped. She was looking at me carefully. "You knew," she said, "when you were doing all of this, you knew the council was moving toward the decree." I looked at the ceiling. The ceiling in the exchange office was standard Veth construction, pale gray, slightly textured, designed to absorb sound, functional, not interesting. I looked at it for a moment. "Yes," I said. She waited. I let her wait. Outside the window, the Veth city was moving through its midday cycle, the ambient light shifting as the station's rotation brought the southern sectors into illumination. The room got slightly warmer. I noticed this. The small, ordinary warmth of a room on an afternoon, the kind of detail that only registers when you are sitting in a silence you have no intention of filling. She eventually said, "Why did you continue?" This was the question beneath all the questions, the one the historian's list had been building toward without knowing it. I picked up my cup. The metallic mint had gone cold. I drank it anyway. "Because there were species losing people to problems that had solutions," I said. "And I had the solutions, and choosing not to share them because a political outcome made powerful people uncomfortable is not something I am capable of." She wrote that down. I watched her write it. "That is not how most species would describe military doctrine," she said. "Most species did not spend 1,000 years fighting themselves," I said. "We did not develop this knowledge in theory. We developed it because our people were dying and we were trying to stop that from happening. The same reason the Drenathi needed it. The same reason the Cathari needed it. The same problem, different species, same human answer." The session ran another 90 minutes. Good questions, accurate answers. At the end, she thanked me and said the study would be published through the RIN Academic Archive in 14 months. I told her I would read it. At the door, she paused. "Commander Ward, do you think the decree changed anything?" I thought about the map, the 51 signatures, the second-generation propagation running through academies that had never once had a human instructor. "The decree changed what humans are formally permitted to do," I said. "It did not change what has already been done." She nodded slowly and left. I sat in the empty room with the cold drink and the warm shifting light, and I thought about Owen Dale at his hospital and Claire Finn at hers, and all the other people who had done what I had done in smaller rooms and quieter ways, and the long invisible chain of knowledge running from all of us outward into a galaxy that had voted to stop us 60 years too late. The message came through 3 intermediaries. The first was a cultural exchange coordinator at the VETH consulate, who sent a meeting request worded as an invitation to discuss the upcoming interspecies arts exhibition. The second was a logistics officer from the council's administrative branch, who confirmed the meeting location and mentioned in passing that Councillor Davansoth would be in attendance. The third was Davansoth's personal aide, who told me directly that my presence was required at a private session of the Standing Security Committee, effective the following morning. 3 layers, that was how you knew it was serious. 1 layer meant routine. 2 meant a paper trail. 3 layers meant someone needed to be able to say, if this ever became a matter of formal council record, that the meeting had been initiated through cultural exchange channels and bore no relation to the pacification decree. I packed a bag. I took the early transit. The private chamber was on the 4th level of the council's inner administrative block, well away from the grand assembly hall where the vote had happened. Smaller room, lower ceilings, lighting that was functional rather than ceremonial. The kind of room where things actually get decided, as opposed to the kind of room where decisions get announced after they have already been made somewhere else. 7 delegates were present when I arrived. Davansoth at the head of the table, the RIN security representative who went by a numerical designation in official documents, 2 VETH military analysts, the Kethori block chair, a Solvari observer I did not recognize, a delegate from the VERK, which surprised me. The VERK had been quiet for years, minimal military presence, transitional economy. I sat down without being asked. No one commented on this. Davansoth opened the display. A tactical map filled the center of the table. The Kethori-Solvari border region, 4 systems, current engagement positions marked in amber and red. I had been reading maps like this since before most of the people in this room had entered public service. I looked at it for 3 seconds. I knew what I was looking at. Not because I had designed this specific campaign. I had not. But I had written the doctrine that any commander trained in coalition-adjacent methodology would apply to exactly these terrain conditions and resource distributions. The 3-vector approach, the deliberate supply interdiction running along the secondary corridors, the psychological operation phase designed to create decision paralysis in the opposing command structure, running concurrently with the physical campaign. I had written it in the winter of a year I preferred not to dwell on, in a small office with inadequate heating, and a bottle of something I had told myself was only for thinking, while a campaign in the VEL system was going badly wrong in ways that had woken me at 3 in the morning for 6 consecutive weeks. It had worked. The campaign had turned. I had written up the framework, filed it in the coalition archive under the heading I gave it, and moved on to the next problem. That was 14 years ago. It was now displayed on a table in front of 7 council delegates who were looking at me with the specific expression of people who need something, and are still negotiating with themselves about the cost of asking for it. Davansoth said, "We need to understand this." I said, "What specifically?" He gestured at the map. The Kethori initiated this engagement 11 days ago. The Solvari response has been unexpected. Our analysts cannot account for their positioning. Our models project a significant engagement within 8 to 14 days, with casualty projections that are unacceptable. Whose framework are the Kethori running? Silence. Not the silence of people who do not know. The silence of people who know and are deciding whether to say it. A methodology consistent with coalition tactical frameworks, the RIN delegate said carefully. Adapted for Kethori operational capacity. And the Solvari. A pause. Then the VERK delegate said quietly, also adapted from coalition sources, a different branch of the same methodology. I looked at the map. 2 species, both running adapted versions of doctrine that traced back to human military frameworks. facing each other across a border dispute that arbitration could have resolved 18 months ago, now locked into an engagement geometry that was going to produce a catastrophic result unless someone who understood the underlying logic intervened. The Council had banned humans from military involvement 14 months ago. I was in a basement room with 7 delegates, and a problem that was going to kill a great many people. I picked up the stylus on the table in front of me. I straightened it against the edge, parallel, exact. "Walk me through the Solvari Eastern positioning," I said. Davensoth pulled the eastern sector up. The Solvari had their flank pulled in tight, compressed, close-grouped, not the wide spread you use to reinforce a defensive line. That was not a defensive formation. A compressed flank is potential energy. It looks like a retreat. It is preparation to advance from a direction no one is watching. You pull your visible position in to invite the opposing force to extend forward, chasing what appears to be a retreating line. Then you drive from the compressed side while they are stretched and exposed and entirely focused on the wrong direction. The Cathari northern advance was the invitation. They were walking into it right now. "Pull the northern advance back," I said. "Full withdrawal to the secondary position. Do not advance north for the next 6 days." Davensoth stared at me. The Cathari command structure believes the northern advance is the decisive opportunity of the engagement. The Cathari command structure was trained by instructors who learned from people who learned from me, I said. Whoever designed the Solvari response also learned from people who learned from me. They are playing the same game from different chapters. I straightened the stylus again. It was already straight. "The eastern compression is not a retreat," I said. "It is Chapter 7. I know this because I wrote Chapter 7. If the Cathari advance north, the Solvari will drive east into an undefended corridor and reach the supply anchor before anyone can reposition. The northern units will be cut off. The engagement will be over in 36 hours, and the outcome will be a disaster." The room was very quiet. The Cathari block chair said, "You are certain?" "I wrote the playbook being used on both sides of this map," I said. "Yes, I am certain." Davensoth looked at the other delegates. A look that contained a whole conversation. The conversation about what it meant that they were sitting in this room asking for exactly what they had voted to prohibit. He looked at me. "If we were to request your assistance in," he started. "That would violate the decree," I said. "Yes." I looked at the map. "Good thing I am only providing cultural context," I said. I pulled the display toward me. 3 hours. I worked for 3 hours without stopping. The delegates asked questions and I answered them. When data was missing, I said what I needed and they produced it. When analysis required decisions, I laid out the options and their consequences and let the delegates choose, because I was providing cultural context and not making tactical decisions, and everyone in that room understood exactly what that distinction meant and how meaningless it was. The stylus stayed on the table in front of me. I straightened it every 20 minutes without thinking about it. At one point I caught myself doing it and counted back. 11 times. 11 times in 3 hours. Once for every number on the display that reminded me of a different room, a different campaign, a different set of people who had not all come home from it. By the end of the 3 hours, the Cathari northern advance had orders to pull back. The Solvari eastern compression had been identified and a counterpositioning mapped. The engagement geometry that had been pointing toward catastrophe had been redirected toward something that could be managed toward settlement. I pulled a file from my handheld before I stood, 14 years old, never distributed outside the Coalition Advisory Archive. I set it on the table. "That is the counter-framework for everything in the doctrine you are looking at," I said. "Every offensive application has a documented response. Right now the offensive side is propagating through your academies, but the response side is not, because it was filed under restricted access and I held the access. If you want these engagements to stay survivable on both sides, the defensive doctrine needs to spread as fast as the offensive doctrine already has. Nobody moved for a moment. The RIN delegate reached out and took the file. I stood up, gathered my notes. In the corridor outside, the RIN security representative was standing near the transit junction. She was small and unhurried in the way of people who do not waste movement. She said, "Thank you." I straightened my jacket. "Cultural exchange," I said. I walked out into the light. That night the map had 49 active signatures. 2 had resolved. The Cathori-Solvari engagement was pulling back from its critical edge and moving toward the mediated settlement track, slowly, but moving. I did not feel like I had won anything. I felt like I had done the work that needed doing, the same way I had always done the work that needed doing. The question of whether I was formally permitted to do it had never once been the most important question in any room I had sat in. The most important question was always the same question. Were people going to die unnecessarily? If the answer was yes, and I could do something about it, then I was going to do something about it. The decree could stand in the corridor and wait. I made something warm to drink and sat at my window for a while, watching the amber city and the not dark beyond it, and then I went to sleep. 2 years after the Cathori-Solvari engagement, the council announced it was reconsidering the pacification decree. They did not phrase it that way. The official language was formal reassessment of human integration policy in response to evolving galactic security context. 12 words where 3 would have worked. The 3 words were, "We were wrong." I read the announcement on a Tuesday morning. Petra had flagged it at the top of my briefing notes with a notation that said, "relevant to your situation," which was the most restrained possible description of a political reversal I had encountered in a long career of political reversals. They wanted me to attend the ceremony. Not asked, wanted. When the council asks, they send a formal request through official channels and you respond through official channels, and there is a paper trail on both sides. When they want, they send a personal message from the new council chair herself. Councillor Mavarin was 42, Reform faction, genuinely committed to institutional accountability in the way that distinguished people who meant it from people who had merely learned to describe it convincingly. She had been appointed 18 months prior, after Davensoth's retirement. She had a reputation for directness that the council's older faction considered dangerous, and that I considered the minimum standard for a conversation worth having. Her message was 3 paragraphs. The first described the ceremony. The second explained what the council intended the occasion to represent. The third asked if I would be willing to say a few words. I read it twice. I wrote back the same day. The ceremonial hall was the same one. Of course it was. The Grand Assembly, arranged in dress configuration, flags by species protocol, atmospheric stations adjusted for the full gallery, the center stage lit with the quality of light the council used for moments it wanted people to remember. I arrived early and stood in the back of the upper gallery before anyone else came in. Same tessellated ceiling, 216 panels. I had counted them during the vote 2 years ago. I went down to my seat. The delegates filed in. All 47 species, full representation, formal dress across every block. The Cathori were there in larger numbers than usual, 30 delegates rather than 20, which was permitted on significant occasions. Their updated dress uniform had been revised 3 times in the past decade, each revision making it more distinctly Cathori and less visibly coalition-adjacent. Borrowed things become the borrower's own. That is how it works when the borrowing is genuine. Councillor Mavarin was at the podium at exactly the scheduled time. She spoke well. She had the quality, rare in formal settings, of sounding like she meant her words rather than performing the meaning of them. She spoke about the decade since first contact with human military systems, about the complexity of receiving knowledge you did not ask for, and then discovering that the knowledge had already become part of how you did everything. About fear, about how fear of something powerful sometimes dresses itself up as policy and calls itself protection. She said the pacification decree had been passed in fear and maintained in denial, and that the council was ending it not as a favor to humanity, but as an acknowledgement that the conversation that needed to happen had been taking place for 2 years in back rooms and private chambers and cultural exchange offices, and it was time to have it in the open. She was good. I watched the gallery, 311 delegates, the flags of 47 species, the careful architecture of a moment that wanted to be a turning point. I thought about the map. The most recent count was 63 active signatures. The number was still climbing. The counter-doctrine file I had left on a table 2 years ago had been distributed to 14 species command academies and was now being taught alongside the offensive frameworks, which meant the engagements that occurred were at least survivable on both sides with greater frequency than before. The galaxy was not more peaceful. It was more competent. Those are not the same thing. Competence does not end conflict. It changes what conflict costs. It brings more people home. It names the damage that does not show on a scan so that someone can treat it. It means the person who went in has a better chance of coming back, and the person who comes back has a better chance of becoming someone who can live with what they carried home. That was the work, not glory, not winning. The specific, unglamorous work of reducing the cost of something that was going to happen regardless. I was called to the podium. The walk from my seat to the center stage was not physically long. It felt longer, because I was thinking about what I was going to say and whether it was what the room wanted to hear, and whether that distinction mattered. It mattered. I stood at the podium, 311 delegates in the rings below, press recording stations at 4 positions, the formal weight of a moment waiting to become the version of itself that would appear in history files for the next several hundred years. I looked at the room. Then I started. You banned us because you were afraid of what we were. The room was very still. You were right to be afraid, not of us, of what you were about to learn, because the thing you were afraid of was not weapons and it was not aggression. It was the knowledge of how to survive a long conflict, and once you had that knowledge, it did not stay contained. It moved into your field manuals and your command academies and your surgical protocols and your psychological support systems and your supply infrastructure, and it became indistinguishable from your own doctrine, because knowledge does not remember where it came from. I paused, not for effect, because the next part needed to land without anything around it. You did not contract something from us. You received a transplant. The transplant took. And now you are looking at a galaxy full of species that sustain their forces longer, bring more of their people home alive, and treat the ones who return carrying invisible damage with something approaching actual care, and you want to have a ceremony about it. The silence in the hall had changed quality. Not the waiting silence of a room expecting a speech to end. The harder silence of a room sitting with something that was uncomfortable in a way that was also true. I do not want a seat at this table. I want you to understand what is already sitting in every other seat. Every species represented here has military infrastructure that carries the trace of human knowledge. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that the ban was always a gesture at a problem that had already resolved itself through the oldest mechanism. There is people learning things, and then teaching those things to other people, because they could not look at someone dying from a problem that had a solution and choose not to share it. I straightened my jacket with one hand. The decree was a door. The horse, the barn, and the entire surrounding territory had relocated before you closed it. What you are lifting today is not a restriction. It is a formality. I suggest we treat it as one and get back to work. I stepped back from the podium. I returned to my seat. The hall held its quiet. 11 seconds. I counted. I have gotten very good at counting silences. The response was mixed. Some delegations registered approval through their species-appropriate channels. Others registered discomfort through theirs. The Cathari block was completely still, which with the Cathari meant something was being processed seriously at depth. 3 delegates approached me after the session before I could reach the corridor. The first was a young Veth counselor who said the speech had been bold and offered the Veth equivalent of congratulations. I thanked her. The second was a Cathari military attaché who said nothing at all. He looked at me for a long moment with the steady, measuring focus his species uses when forming an opinion they have not finished yet. Then he inclined his head slowly and moved on. The third was a human, young, maybe 28, in the cultural exchange delegate uniform, part of the observer rotation I had met briefly months earlier. Her name was Laura Webb. She had come to Veth Prime from a posting on the outer stations. She said, "Was that the right thing to say?" I looked at her. "It was the true thing," I said. "Are those the same?" I thought about it. In a council chamber today, yes. She looked back at the emptying hall, at the flags still arranged in their formal positions, the stage lights beginning their post-session dimming cycle. "They are going to argue about that speech for years," she said. "Good," I said. "Arguments mean they are thinking about it. The alternative is that they do not think about it, and then we are back in a room with a map full of problems and no one who knows what they are looking at." She absorbed that, nodded once. She was going to be fine. The ones who asked whether the right thing and the true thing were the same always turned out fine. I told her to find the conflict map in the council's open archive and learn to run a doctrine detection filter on it. She said she would. I left. The corridor was the long kind with the good echo, and my footsteps were patient in it, same as they had been 2 years before walking out of a different session. I had learned the specific quality of light in all these corridors, the amber-filtered illumination of the lower administrative level, the flat, functional brightness of the transit junction ahead. I was almost to the junction when I heard steps behind me. Slow, deliberate, the steps of someone who has learned to be careful about movement. I turned. The RIN security delegate, the one who had been at the original vote, who had been in the private chamber 2 years ago, who had taken the counter-doctrine file from the table, was standing 10 feet away. He was older now in a way he had not been old before, not diminished, the kind of age that accumulates when you have been making difficult decisions for a long time and have not been wrong as rarely as you needed to be. He said, "My granddaughter commands a battalion." I waited. Third engagement of the Vel Perimeter Campaign 18 months ago. Her unit was cut off. Supply line collapsed. He paused. She used the evacuation protocol, the one in the Coalition Field Medicine Archive. He did not say who had written the evacuation protocol. He did not need to. 41 of 44 came home, he said. Before that protocol existed, that engagement pattern would have meant losing 30 of 44, at minimum. I stood in the corridor and I looked at this old RIN delegate and I thought about 30 names I did not know, people I had never met, participants in a campaign I had not been part of, in a system I had never visited. People who were home because of 9 days in a small office 14 years ago. Because of Claire Fenn arguing with me until 2 in the morning about physiological response variables. Because of a framework built under bad lighting in a difficult winter when everything had seemed like it was going wrong, and the only answer available was to keep working the problem. He said, "I voted for the decree." I know. I should not have. He was not asking for absolution. He was not performing regret for an audience. He was a very old delegate in a corridor who had done something he had reconsidered, and was saying so, plainly, to the person it most directly concerned. "You voted with the information you had," I said. "Everyone does." He nodded. He walked away. I stood in the corridor for a while after he was gone. The council had offered the human delegation full voting membership, a seat at the table, formal and permanent, with all the procedural rights that entailed. I had sent a note through Petra to the delegation coordinator recommending they give the seat to someone younger, someone who still found the table exciting rather than familiar, someone for whom the vote would feel like something other than the logical ending of a story that had started before they were born. I kept my title, Cultural Liaison Coordinator. The desk was good. The window was good. Petra was thorough and cheerful and had not once in 2 years acted like she was professionally managing me, which I had eventually realized meant she was extremely good at it. I let myself into my office, made something warm to drink, ate what Petra had left on the corner of the desk, which appeared to be a pastry of some kind. She had a habit of leaving small food items when she knew a long day was coming, and I had stopped asking about the ingredients because the not knowing made them taste better. I opened the conflict map. 61 signatures. 2 had resolved in the last 48 hours, both moving toward managed settlement, both engagements pulling back from their critical edges toward the slower, negotiated track that did not make news and did not require ceremonies, but kept people alive. The counter-doctrine work was producing results, slowly, unevenly, but real. That is the thing about fire. You cannot vote it out of a building it has already filled. You cannot pass a decree that removes it from the architecture of everything it has touched. You can learn to live inside it carefully. You can learn to direct it toward the things that need burning and away from the things that do not. You can build people who know the difference and who will teach other people, and who will insist that the teaching continue regardless of what a marble hall full of frightened delegates decides to call it on any given Tuesday. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, almost everything. I closed the map. I poured something decent from the bottle in the bottom drawer. I sat at the window. The city was doing its amber evening thing below, the warm light shifting across the grid in the